This segment is on Ancient of Days, which is a scriptural phrase meaning knowledge of the times, those of Christian history all the way back to its roots, as well as into the present and the future from our time now. This study helps explain why truth has been winning so much lately. It's because its time has come by natural forces. In fact, let me be frank for a minute here. The ancient prophets of old would have given their right arm to see this time today because every one of them knew of it, studied it, and many spoke of it in some ways, and they knew it would be a time of major transition unlike ever before or ever again to occur. They also knew, as we're only now starting to realize, that a lot of really meaningful and powerful knowledge that has been hidden for decades and centuries, even for thousands of years, is now being revealed in our time. The Ancient of Days study is part of how that happens. It is not only a calendar of times, but a tool for deciphering ancient texts only useful to people today who, much unlike common theologians of our time, already accept some of the more politically incorrect and lesser known truths of the present. And what it does for them is it sets them apart in time, so to speak. It gives them tomorrow's bread today, which is actually what the Lord's Prayer says in the Greek. But this segment is only about the basic time references that make all that possible. There are 133 references in the Bible to 3 days or a third day. By contrast, there are only 16 references to a fourth day. The reason is the third day reference is a sacred term used to metaphorically refer to ordained time, provided time, the time until the end of time when the providence of the people is secure. After this, there are other dynamics that come into play. These 3 days are also referred to as time, times, and a portion. And Daniel describes an event to which many time measurements relate. It's called the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem. It was supposed to be somewhere around 400 plus BC. But there is some dispute about which king should have given the command and why the weeks of Daniel don't add up to the time of the coming of Christ. These things have always been a bit of a mystery. But if you go back about 1,000 years before that time, you find Joshua giving a command typologically similar to this event. In 1408, Joshua gave the command to cross the Jordan and take the Promised Land, where they would build a stronghold, a government stronghold of peace and prosperity and religious order, which is what the term Jerusalem came to mean in that time and to represent in sacred context since then. So then if you consider Hezekiah added 15 years to the calendar in his time and measure 1,015 years from that time of Joshua, you get 393 BC. This was the time of the first day, making the second time, or the times, 2,000 years, which brings you exactly to 1607 when King James gave an order to translate the Bible into English for the people. This command would essentially inspire the New World to be settled and developed. Having the Bible now in English is what inspired the Protestants to then flee religious persecution and settle the New World, building again a nation and a government of peace and prosperity and religious order, which is to say, yet another Jerusalem. That leaves the portion of time to be resolved, and the other prophet that teaches about time is Ezekiel, the Son of Man prophet. One of the first things he is shown is 2 time periods, 390 years and 40 years. The book of Ezekiel also begins at the river Shebar, which means extent of time. Some of the most ancient sages believe we live in a 6,000 year period of time represented in Scripture as the 6 days of creation. And 6,000 years measures from 4004 BC, Adam, to 1996-7, depending on the month, AD. But if you look back 390 years from 97, you are exactly at the time of the King James command. So the 40 years would be the time looking forward from that time, and we're exactly in the middle of that today. It's also it was expressed fairly well soon after that time that we live in a different sort of age. Some of you may recall it was even on CNN after 9/11. I remember hearing that and laughing because I thought it hilarious that the opposition was preaching vital truth that day. It's probably one of the only times. But seeing that all these time periods fit mathematically and how each of these commands initiated the start of another age and government, let me assert something else about the second age here. In this 2,000 years, the stronghold of peace and prosperity and religious order for Christianity was in Western Europe, not in the old land. And this brings into question how and why it is that every theologian that's ever lived has failed to answer the paradox about the times of Daniel. They were looking on the wrong side of the world for it. There was also two different strains of the tribe of Judah at that time. One of them was tending to material things, and one to the spiritual parallels. This was exactly when the lost tribes were becoming the individual nations they were promised to become in early Western Europe. There's also the factor we can fairly well come to grips with today, like never before, that Christian leadership has been subverted and misguided over and over again through the ages. But there's a lot of other scripture that plays into this question too. For instance, Deuteronomy 32:8 describes how the sons of Adam were set apart from the other races of the world with borders according to the children of Israel. And there are actually 3 generations of inheritances promised. The first was to each tribe. The next was to the 2 sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. And there's a third to the son of Ephraim. Well, the nations have also been settled by the same genealogy and according to the times of the study. Great Britain began forming in 1605, and it was actually the goings on at that same time that led to the order of King James, so it was virtually the same time. 3.5 nations became Great Britain and received a uniquely global inheritance in its colonizing efforts. This identifies with Manasseh. It also compares with the story of old when Reuben, Gad, Levi, and half the tribe of Manasseh, which already had land east of the Jordan, went into the promised land to help the other tribes take that land. It was 3.5 each time. And half of Manasseh would be given land on the other side of the Jordan after that, while in the later time, Britain also has Canada on the other side of the Atlantic. Then in 1776, the second brother, Ephraim, came along, which was to be the greater heir, and it became the U.S. And there's probably no other year than 1997 that best describes the demise of Great Britain. So it fits just exactly in this time period. In 1997, the House of Lords was disbanded, and 2 of the member nations of Great Britain set up their own parliaments. But the name Manasseh means to forget, and regretfully it seems the land is now suffering from forgetting things it has known better in the past. The meaning of the name Ephraim, however, means double fruit. There is also one last inheritance to the son of Ephraim. Accordingly, there has been an ongoing separation of the people of truth in the U.S. that actually started 20 years ago and is obviously driven by the hardships we are now seeing all across the free world. And let's look at one other matter of time here. Early in Genesis, we're told the life of man would be 120 years. Now, there's a sacred term called the Jubilee year that comes every 49 years. Every 49 years, the next year is the first of the next 49, but it's called the 50th year, and that's the Jubilee year. That's the time of repossession and major social transition. But it's always been a mystery why it's called the 50th year instead of the first of the next 49. But what's interesting about this is that 120 49s comes up to 5880, and if you measure that from 4004 BC Adam, it takes you to 1877. The 50th 120 years then, or the Jubilee period, if you will, the time of repossession, is that 50th 120 years, or 1877 to 1997. Now notice how that perfectly encapsulates the industrial age, in fact all the way up to the information age. And that period was by far the most unusual in world history, as the industrialized nations came to essentially repossess much of the world with trade. And if you learn from that, then you can reason that when Moses said the life of man would be 70 years at the Exodus, there may also be some relevant connotation concerning the 50th 70-year period from when he said that in 1448. And as it turns out, allowing again for Hezekiah, the 50th 70-year period would begin in 1997. So there was a 120-year period of Jubilee for all of man, and that ended in 97, and at that point a Jubilee for the Son of Man began, and we're in that now. The Son of Man is man that lives after the ordained time of man. Man refers to the Hebrew term Adam, and the time of Adam was 6,000 years. So after that is the time of the Son of Man. And we learn this from Ezekiel, the one prophet referred to as the Son of Man, whose testament begins at the end of time. It was his word, in fact, that changed the time for all of us 20 years ago, but that's another story. Anyway, the fourth age is roughly one generation when a lot of ancient prophecy comes to life again. The teacher is truth, and the mission is to build a new stronghold for peace and prosperity again, to secure the future development of divine wisdom. Thank you.